My name is Maggie, and I work as an office professional in a prominent company. One day, fate led me to encounter a man named Scott, and our connection blossomed into a romantic relationship. Eventually, I found myself accepting his proposal, and we entered into marriage. Initially, I believed that tying the knot with someone seemingly mentally stable like Scott would pave the way for a happy union. However, it didn't take long for me to realize that this decision was a significant misjudgment. The first time I crossed paths with Scott was at a matchmaking event organized by the company I worked for. Despite my initial lack of enthusiasm for such gatherings, I decided to attend due to the company's influence, which suggested it might lead to a meaningful encounter. Scott and I naturally struck up a conversation, seated in close proximity. He, being 5 years my senior at 30, exuded a calm demeanor that caught my attention. As our interactions progressed, we started dating. Scott, always clad in high-end attire, took charge of our dates, prompting me to wonder about his financial status. Although I felt a twinge of guilt for constantly being treated, I found myself drawn to his personality and continued the relationship. Then came the day when Scott proposed, and despite my initial intentions not to marry for wealth, I was swayed by his kind nature and accepted. When I visited Scott's family home for pre-marriage introductions, I was taken aback by the opulence of the house and its expansive garden. Inquiring about his family's wealth out of genuine surprise, Scott nonchalantly dismissed it as nothing special. However, the obvious extravagance suggested otherwise, challenging the notion of an average employee affording such a lifestyle. Intrigued, I wondered about Scott's father, whom he rarely spoke of. During the visit, Scott's mother, dressed in expensive attire, revealed that his father was not present due to being in a facility for health reasons, a fact previously unknown to me. This revelation left me feeling uneasy, sensing that something was amiss. The discomfort I experienced during this encounter would later manifest in our married life. After tying the knot, Scott proposed that we live together with his mother in their family home, expressing concern for her well-being if left alone. While my initial desire was to live solely with my husband, I empathized with Scott's sentiments. Given that my parents were still actively working, I agreed to move in with Scott's family. However, upon settling into Scott's family home, I encountered unexpected scenes. On the day of the move, the house appeared more disorganized than during my initial visit. Laundry piled up for days, and it seemed cleaning had been neglected. Perhaps Scott's mother was too preoccupied with other responsibilities. Despite my decision not to let it bother me, I felt the need to address something with Scott. As a couple, I insisted on contributing to our living expenses. The guilt I carried from being consistently treated during our dating phase motivated me to take financial responsibility, even in the context of living with Scott's family. "Maggie, you really don't need to worry about money," Scott reassured me, maintaining his usual nonchalant attitude toward financial matters. However, during this conversation, Jane, Scott's mother, interjected with a strong tone. "God is right. We have plenty of money, so don't worry. More importantly, that woman can't even do household chores properly. She's useless, and I'm going to fire her today." Her words took me by surprise, and I couldn't help but wonder who she was referring to. Scott clarified that she was talking about the housekeeper they had hired. Despite thinking that Jane could manage the chores herself, I refrained from voicing this thought aloud. Upon observing the housekeeper at work, she seemed efficient and capable. Contrary to Jane's disapproving glances and occasional sighs while snacking and watching TV, the housekeeper appeared diligent. I couldn't fathom what Jane disliked about her. To my shock, after the housekeeper finished her day's work, Jane abruptly fired her, throwing her last pay at her. Witnessing this harsh treatment left me perturbed. The housekeeper, visibly shocked, departed with tears streaming down her cheeks. Following her departure, Jane made a surprising announcement to me. "So, from now on, you're in charge of the housework. Okay." Upon learning that I was unilaterally assigned the role of housekeeper, anxiety consumed me. The fear of being exploited by Jane became a daunting reality the next day. She began imposing all household responsibilities on me, cooking 3 meals, managing laundry, cleaning everyone's rooms, and even tending to the garden. When I mentioned my daytime job to Jane, she casually dismissed it, instructing me to handle everything after returning home, including preparing lunch in the morning. Scott heard this but remained uninvolved, displaying an attitude as if it were all self-evident. Initially thinking it might be a jest, I soon realized Jane was serious. Consequently, I found myself embroiled in a daily struggle to balance my job and the mounting housework, while Jane continued to live a carefree life, indulging in luxurious hotel buffet lunches with friends. Scott, too, cruised around in a luxury car, leaving me perplexed about how they could afford such a lavish lifestyle. Even if Scott earned a substantial salary, the extravagant living of both mother and son seemed implausible. It was then that I recollected Scott's father, whom I had never met. Since marrying into the family, I had yet to greet him, and a desire to meet and converse with him grew within me. Inquiring about Steve's whereabouts, Scott responded indifferently, questioning the purpose of meeting his father. Despite Scott's disinterest, I felt it was a matter of courtesy to meet him at least once as a family. Without informing Scott or Jane, I decided to visit Steve's facility. Upon meeting him, Steve appeared understandably surprised. After all, no one anticipates their son's wife making a sudden visit. After the initial shock, Scott's father shared various untold stories with me. Steve's father had once operated a small shop, sustaining the family's livelihood. However, when he fell seriously ill, young Steve had to take over the shop. Recognizing the limitations of just running the shop, Steve believed in expanding the business for future survival. He ventured into managing restaurants and recycling shops, even going into debt to make it happen. This bold move turned out to be a massive success, providing a stable and substantial income. Now the extravagant lifestyle of Jane and Scott began to make sense. It was all thanks to Steve's entrepreneurial success. Hearing this insightful story directly from Steve shed light on the family dynamics and the source of their prosperity. I felt a deep sense of kinship with Steve as I learned more about his entrepreneurial journey. This connection arose because my own father, in his youth, had also run a successful business. It seemed that my father, like Steve, possessed foresight, anticipating the burgeoning era of information technology, an uncommon insight at that time. My father diligently studied computers, eventually opening a shop specializing in computer peripherals and repairs. Although not as financially lucrative as Steve's ventures, it provided a comfortable life for our family. In light of these similarities, I felt compelled to share my genuine feelings with Steve, expressing admiration for the significant effort he had invested in expanding his business. Steve, blushing with a shy smile, responded modestly, attributing the success to his father. He acknowledged the foundational role his father played, emphasizing that their current life was a result of his father's vision. It became evident that Steve held deep respect and pride for his father, and in turn, I found myself feeling a similar pride for my own father. As our conversations continued, I developed a genuine affection for Steve. Frequent visits to the facility where he resided allowed our bond to grow stronger. During one of these visits, Steve confided in me about his discontent. He expressed gratitude for having a daughter-in-law like me, but lamented that Scott and Jane hardly visited him. Furthermore, he voiced concern about their reckless spending habits and their apparent disregard for the value of money. These words resonated with my own discomfort regarding Scott and Jane's extravagant lifestyle. It became clear that they were not only spending Steve's hard-earned money carelessly, but also exploiting it for their own desires. I couldn't help but view them as despicable for their actions. In a moment of profound silence, Steve shared a somber revelation. He would be passing away soon. Learning about his limited time left from his primary doctor at the facility, I couldn't hold back tears. Steve's vulnerability and gratitude for our connection touched my heart deeply. Upon returning to the family home, I witnessed Scott and Jane's continued indulgence in their lavish lifestyle. If anything, their attitudes seemed to worsen since I began living with them. Filled with a sense of responsibility, I decided to address the issue. When I asked Scott why he didn't visit his father, he vehemently rejected the idea, asserting that it was none of his business. Jane echoed his sentiments, dismissing any interference as unpleasant and unnecessary. The harshness of their words fueled my anger. Despite Steve's sacrifices that had sustained their current lifestyle, they seemed oblivious to the consequences of their careless spending. In that moment, my frustration and disappointment with Scott and Jane reached its peak. Deep in my heart, I made a silent vow to wholeheartedly support Steve. A few weeks after this incident, somber news arrived. Steve had passed away. Despite mentally preparing myself for such an inevitability, the reality of it brought forth uncontrollable tears. Strangely, Scott and his mother appeared far from saddened by Steve's passing. Instead, they seemed almost jubilant. Overhearing their conversation, it became apparent that Steve had left a substantial fortune of $4 million, and they were behaving as if it were already theirs. Their despicable behavior, consumed by greed, astounded me. Rather than mourning Steve's death, they were excited about the potential inheritance, expressing sentiments like, "Now we can live even better, and I'll quit my job too." Jane's shocking comment about holding a funeral just to secure the inheritance further revealed their callous nature. With a mocking laugh, she said to me, "Oh, that's right, Maggie. You don't need to come to the funeral. You're an outsider. Please don't get involved with us anymore." It felt as though she was insinuating that there would be no inheritance for me. There were no words to describe them beyond demons or devils. Realizing I couldn't endure staying in that house any longer, I reflected on my decision made a few days earlier when I visited Steve. He had hinted that his time was near, and understanding the uncertainty, I had spoken with him and bid my goodbyes. Calmly responding to Jane, I acquiesced, stating that I wouldn't attend the funeral. Turning to Scott, I handed him divorce papers. His surprise contrasted with Jane's almost pleased expression. Perhaps she believed that without the marriage, I wouldn't claim any inheritance. Under the pressure from his mother, Scott, though bewildered, signed the divorce papers. Murmuring to himself in disbelief, he couldn't comprehend the gravity of the situation. While Scott and his mother busied themselves with funeral preparations, I meticulously packed up my belongings, arranged for a new apartment, and explained the situation to my parents and workplace. By the time Steve's funeral concluded, I had already left the family home. Scott and his mother likely felt a sense of relief, believing they were free of any potential entanglements. Even before completing the funeral arrangements, they had booked flights and luxury hotels for an overseas trip. Little did they know, retribution awaited them. It began the day after I departed the family home when I received a call from Jane. Ignoring the calls due to being at work, I later discovered dozens of missed calls on my phone. Fearing what Jane might say, I continued to avoid her calls. As expected, their persistence escalated, with Scott joining the effort. In their desperation, they might contact my workplace or my parents. Anticipating this, I had already taken precautions. My parents had moved to the new apartment, creating a shield against any attempts to involve them in the unfolding drama. I rented a new place, keeping the address confidential from everyone, as expected. A few weeks later, Scott and Jane appeared at my parents' house. Anticipating their disruptive behavior, I had informed my neighbors to contact me if any disturbance arose. My intuition proved right, as they began asking around for my whereabouts, causing trouble for the neighbors. Upon receiving the updates, I immediately contacted the police, urging them to investigate the disturbance. The police swiftly arrived, delivering a stern warning to Scott and his mother, preventing them from approaching the family home area again. Although my parents occasionally returned for cleaning and chores, Scott and Jane didn't relent. They even went as far as visiting my workplace. However, I had already briefed the security guard at the entrance, informing them that I had resigned. Jane, undeterred, insisted on seeing me, deeming my resignation a transparent lie. Her persistence led the security guard to threaten police involvement, prompting her to reluctantly give up. Despite their relentless efforts, the relentless pair continued their search for me. They made incessant phone calls and even visited the city office in an attempt to discover my address. It was an utterly exasperating situation. However, they soon realized a crucial detail since Scott and I were already divorced. My surname had naturally changed. At the city office, they found no record under my new name. The desperation to find me stemmed from Steve's will. The day after I left the family home, Jane discovered the will, which explicitly stated that all of Steve's inheritance would go to me. Steve had made this decision during his lifetime, a reaction to Jane and Scott's selfish and unreasonable behavior. In light of their mistreatment, rejoicing at his facility admission, and neglecting to visit him, Steve chose to leave everything to the person who had cared for him, me. This inheritance included the family home, making it my property. However, as I didn't have a need for Steve's lands or properties, I decided to sell them immediately. This was a decision I had discussed with Steve while he was alive, and the arrangements had already been made with a real estate agent. Consequently, Jane and Scott had to vacate the family home. Scott, who had quit his job in anticipation of the inheritance, found himself unemployed, and his problematic work attitude ensured that the company readily accepted his resignation. The two, who had initially been excited about a $4 million windfall, found themselves with nothing. Unable to go on their planned overseas trip, they had to pay cancellation fees for booked flights and luxury hotels. Desperately seeking me, a year passed, and they seemed to have finally given up. Rumors suggested that Jane and Scott now lived in an old, modest apartment without a bath, barely making ends meet with day jobs. In contrast, I chose to donate the entire inheritance to charity. While accumulating wealth through hard work is commendable, true happiness doesn't always come with riches. I believed in saving only what is necessary and using the rest for the betterment of the world. These values were shared by my father, Steve, and me. Since I hadn't sought Steve's wealth, it felt wrong to keep it all. My decision was made after consulting my parents. Now free from the clutches of Jane and Scott, I live peacefully, respecting my parents, and cherishing the memories with Steve. I intend to continue living positively, holding these values dear.